three possibilities. It's you either set out to write about certain things and then write about them, or discover that you're writing about some certain things somewhere in the writing process, or the third option, which is that the book comes out and people start to review it and talk about it and notice things about it that had never occurred to you, which is happening already for me with this book. But the one that the thematic aspect that you asked about, having to do with the sort of like the border between self and outside, self and non-self, I guess, is something that explicitly was of interest to me. I can't say that it was of interest to me when I sat down and started to write each story. But I tend to revise stories for a really long time in general. And in the revision process of a lot of these stories individually, and then certainly of the stories as I started to conceive of them as part of this particular collection, that was something that was very front of mind for me. Like, it felt to me like a big part of what the collection was about.
Okay. And so another thing that I noticed, and I think this is sort of tied to this issue of boundaries, between you as a self and the outside world, or between a character as a self and the outside world, has to do with body horror or like grossness.
Yeah.
Like, there's a lot of smells, and there's a lot of like kind of the gross parts, what most people would consider to be the gross parts of being a human. So like dead skin, feces, mucus, like there's a lot of that stuff happening in this collection.
Yeah, there is. And that's the part I have to admit to you, Brad. And I know this is going to sound like sort of unbelievable or ridiculous, but that's the part that hadn't occurred to me as I was writing. Um, I mean, which isn't to say, obviously, I knew like there's a story that centers on vomit. There's talk of all kinds of bodily things. But it hadn't occurred to me that this was like a major aspect of the collection. And in the two full length reviews that have been written of the book so far, like that is a major focus of them, the major focus of one of them. And when I read that first review, which was written by Hannah Rivers in High Country News, I was like, huh, she really like, she noticed something minor in my collection. And then the second review came out today in the Boston Globe that talks in some detail about that. And then I started to be like, oh, maybe it's me, maybe it's not them. And now you're asking about it as well. And so clearly this is something that is very present in the collection that to me was just, yeah, it was like those details were details like any other. I can't explain it.
Do you, in your day-to-day life or as a child, have like a strong reaction to that sort of stuff, like bodily fluids? And are you grossed out easily or not easily at all?
I think I am grossed out about as much as the average person. I don't think I'm particularly grossed out by things. I will say, I was talking to somebody about this the other day. I will say that I think like bodily things come up in my day-to-day conversations, like with my husband or my son or my mom or my close friends. Like, and I don't know, maybe you can tell me. I don't know if that's like common or uncommon, but I do feel like it's an aspect of daily life that like gets talked about as part of daily life. And something that I am genuinely interested in doing in my work is representing life the way it exists, represent like the way we actually experience it. And so to the extent that these kinds of conversations and these kinds of experiences are things that are very much part of our life, but maybe don't end up on the page that often. It's certainly true that I was trying to put on the page like life as it is, right? So to the extent that like I experience those things and talk about those things, they made their way onto the page.
Yeah, I think there's an intimacy to it for most of us. I think maybe people who work in the medical profession, I think parents of young children often have a comfort level with grossness and bodily
Yes.
fluids. I mean, that's just part of the deal. So I think you become maybe more immersed, and it becomes more day to day when you're in that phase of life. But otherwise, it seems to me like, as you say, this stuff is part of our lived reality, but it tends to be private, I think, for most people. I don't think the really gross stuff or like, I don't know, just dealing with like pooping, this is something you kind of do with the door closed and you pretend it didn't happen.
Yes.
And you don't really talk about it much. Maybe you do. But what's interesting to me is the ways in which we sort of go through all these experiences on a personal level, and it doesn't bother us too much, most of us anyway. And yet, if it's somebody else, it's like, ew.
Yeah. It's true.
Yeah, we're more grossed out by others than we are by ourselves, despite the fact that we are doing essentially the same stuff.
That's true. And it relates, I think, Brad, I mean, now that the book is out and I can read it critically as well as sort of representing myself as author, I think something that occurs to me, even though I can't say that it occurred to me consciously while I was writing the collection, is that there is a relationship, I think, between writing about bodily things, especially like the things that our bodies secrete, like the things that are part of our bodies, but also not part of our bodies. I think there's a relationship between that and like this sort of animating question of the collection having to do with the porousness of the self, right? In that like the fluids we excrete and like the hairs that come off of our body are things that like are both of us and not of us, right? Like there are things that are like part of the outside world as well as part of us. And so it's a way, I think, to kind of render symbolically the kind of animating intellectual or emotional question in the collection. There's this story in the collection called The 18 Girls that I'm thinking about now that you bring it up, in which this character sees this like encrusted booger on the floor of her kindergarten classroom.
Right.
And has this question about like whether our boogers are part of us or not part of us, right? When we like excrete one, is it like losing a limb, right? Is it like have we lost a part of ourselves the way we would think about losing a part of ourselves if we were to lose a limb or or something like that. And so I think it does relate in that sense to some of the questions that the book is about.
It's actually a really good question.
Thank you.
I think. Like I'm speaking specifically to this character wondering about the booger, but I think on a larger level, this question about the self and what is the self cannot be asked enough. I think more people, I encourage everyone to sit around thinking about what a self is. I'm fascinated by that because it is very porous when you start to drill down into it. And these things are not as settled as they seem. And as I think contemporary society would have us believe, there are very blurry lines that we exist within as selves. I mean, is
Absolutely.
that your take on it?
Yes, it absolutely is. And I think, I'm Indian American and grew up in a Indian American family. My parents were immigrants. And I don't want to overstate the role of that in the way I think about it, but I do think that, that in my family's culture and in the family cultures of a lot of people, not just from India, there's a kind of like understanding of communal identity and societal identity, family identity, like identity within, a sibling relationship or a parent-child relationship, like sort of the way in which identity always sort of exists within a collective sense of identity. And I think that probably does inform the way I think about identity just as a human, as a writer. And I think that made its way into the book.
There's a really impressive versatility to these stories. Like you're dealing in so many different worlds and in so many different characters' lives. And yet, of course, there are these binding threads. And one of the things that is attached, I think, to this concern with the self and to these bodily concerns has to do with grief. I feel like grief and death are present throughout this collection. And I know you have been through very difficult loss. You lost your sister Krishna in 2001 to cancer. There's a story in the book called The Irates, where there is a character whose brother has died. And I feel like having gone through a very difficult loss at close range is bound to inform anyone's life, and of course their artistic life and thematic concerns. Like, this is something that you have had to take a very painful look at, right?
That's right. Yeah. I always, I think, identified somewhat as a writer, including as a kid, but the first real writing, sort of sustained writing I ever did was in college. My sister passed away when I was a freshman in college, and I took the spring quarter off and went back to Seattle when, she was in her last months, and spent time with my family and had the summer there, and then came back to college my sophomore year in the fall and took my first creative writing class then. And so
with Adam Johnson.
With Adam Johnson, that's right. Yeah.
At Stanford, right?
At Stanford. And it was a really kind of seminal moment for me in that I was dealing with this really recent important loss in my life, and I was coming to understand myself as a writer, and those two things really became intertwined for me in a way that, like, I think they're still intertwined. Like, I became a writer while trying to understand is the wrong word, I guess, trying to sort of feel and think my way through the loss of my sister. I think writing, like, those of us who write, whether we identify publicly as writers or not, are often doing it not because there's something that we want to say, but because there's something that, like, we don't quite understand. Like, we can't, not that we don't understand it, because there's so much all of us don't understand, but that we can't quite articulate, right? Like, there's something that we're going through that we can't even begin to express. And so we write to try to make our way toward an understanding or articulation of what's happening. And that's what I was doing in that first creative writing class I ever took. And so I think because those are my roots as a writer, in part because of that, like, it's something that I just keep returning to, especially in my short stories, because the short story form was kind of the first form I learned. It was the form I was writing at that time in my life when I was learning to become a writer. And so I sort of think every time I sit down to write a story, it ends up being somehow about grief or about close relationships, where there's some kind of rupture. I don't know if that's, like, that'll always be the case for me, or if it's only the case for the stories in this collection, but certainly, like, there's a real interlinkage for me between those things.
No doubt. I'm somewhat similar. In high school, a good friend of mine's older brother died of cancer.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
And then when I was a sophomore, just down the, I think you're in Fort Collins, right?
Yeah.
So I was at Boulder for college, and one of my friends took his own life when I was, a junior?
Oh, man. Yeah.
Sophomore, junior? Yeah, anyway. Those two things, like, rocked me. Like, I was like, holy, it just, I was not prepared for either, and to see both at kind of close range, or not to, like, witness somebody dying necessarily, but just to see the decline with the cancer of my friend's older brother, and then to just suddenly have my friend check out like that.
Yeah.
I look back on those two losses, and I wonder, it's hard to say, but I wonder if I would have written anything or published anything had it not been for those two things. Do you ever have that conversation with yourself? If your sister had not passed away, do you think you would have taken this path? Would you still be writing and publishing fiction?
I don't know. No, it's such a good question, because, right, like, the reason, I think the reason I was so drawn to writing in that class was because it was offering me something. Like, it was profoundly helping me through this experience that I was having in the wake of my sister's death. And so, yeah, like, what does a counterfactual look like? I think it's very, very possible, like, I would have been drawn to it for some other reason, right? Like, there's that possibility, but it's equally possible that it wouldn't have played that role for me, because I wouldn't have had that experience in the wake of which I needed writing. And so, yeah, maybe I would have gone into some other field entirely, or would have, like, become a journalist, an editor, which I also am, but not have pursued the creative path. Yeah, no, I do think about
Yeah.
that.
And I'm wondering too, like spiritually, you mentioned kind of your upbringing and your family's background. Your parents are immigrated from India, correct? Both
Yeah.
parents?
Yeah.
Okay. So you have kind of that foundation. I don't know if there was any kind of religious upbringing. Are you, what is it, Hindu or is it Buddhism? What is it? Or and nothing?
There are the majority religion in India is Hinduism, but there are Buddhists, there are Muslims, there are Christians. There are all kinds of religions, obviously, represented in India. My parents are both not religious, which is relatively unusual, I would say, especially among Indian immigrant communities in the U.S. But they both sort of rejected organized religion. I think my dad might identify somewhat as Buddhist now, but they were not religious. I didn't grow up with religion in any way. I was always, I think, intrigued by religion just as like a reader and a writer. I was intrigued by the sort of like narrative contained within religion. I would like as a kid, I remember going to church with Christian friends and like hearing those Bible stories and just like they were good stories, you know. Um, and so I found that compelling. What happened was when my sister was sick, she became interested in all kinds of religion and Christianity and Hinduism and Buddhism and would talk about religion in a way that like nobody ever had talked about religion in our family before. And I think like that experience of hearing that and squaring it with like the way we'd been as a family or the way she and I had been as sisters or the way she had been as an individual was like confusing, but also I saw something valuable in it. You know, I don't identify as religious in any way, but I think like part of me wants to, you know. Like I think there's something beautiful and moving um and like useful about religion. And so especially I think like while my sister was sick and then after she passed away, especially in those first, I don't know, 10 or 15 years after she passed away, I think like those ideas that she had, those things that she was talking about when she was sick before she passed away, like were always kind of filtering through my consciousness. I was always kind of thinking about them.
What were the ideas?
Oh, I mean, nothing, nothing particularly, you know, like theologically groundbreaking, I'm sure, but she would talk about like the the meaning of finding purpose in life, right? Uh the value, I should say, of finding sort of like determining one's own purpose in life, the idea that we're all here for some reason, the idea that like we're all cared for, that there's some energy or God or whatever that like takes an interest in us and wants to see us thrive. Those kinds of things.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, because I feel like when you, I mean, I went through this, like, it does force upon you a kind of reckoning. Like, what do I think?
Yeah.
What does happen after somebody passes away? What's going to happen when I die? Like,
Yeah.
suddenly you're questioning and trying to make sense of like life and death. And I think maybe this is where fiction can be a lure and a comfort because it's a great space to explore questions. It's not really a place for answers, right? It's the place where you get to be in that like middle area or that gray zone, as I like to call it. I'm I feel it in this collection, you know, like we've been talking about this issue of boundaries and the body. But did you like have you come to any conclusions or do you have like a system of operation in life that is derived from these experiences of loss and maybe these creative experiences that have resulted?
No, not at all. What I can say, I think, and again, it's hard to know whether this is like derives directly from lessons from my sister or lessons from watching what she went through and her passing away, or whether I would have come to it in some other way. But I do feel that it's important to me to sort of honor and appreciate the lives that we do have and the world that we're in and the experiences past and present that we've been given. And I think I bring that up in part because I think that's a kind of world view that is present in the collection. The idea that like there's grief and there's suffering, and yet like here we are, and how lucky is that? You know, I certainly that is certainly something that my sister imparted.
And when it comes to like setting out to define your purpose in life, as she like talked about as she was dealing with her illness, like is that something you took to heart? Like when it comes to writing fiction, for example, because as you mentioned earlier, you also do work as a journalist and an editor. Like, was there some sort of moment you had in your college years or shortly thereafter where you sort of charted your course or said, this is my purpose in life?
You know, it's interesting because for me, those questions of purpose feel less tied to my work or my art actually than to my actual personal relationships. Um, which is funny to say because I think like anybody around me would describe me as artistically and professionally ambitious. And I certainly like, I spend a lot of my time working on my art. But for me, I guess for me, my writing, including my creative writing, but also including my journalistic writing and my work as an editor and my work as a teacher, all of that feels like an expression of like my interest in relationships among between people and among people, and the kind of like the value of those, and it's something that matters to me in my personal life, and so it's something that I write about. And I'm sure, I know it's the case that like my work, my writing is really important to me, and my journalism and my teaching is really important to me. But it feels like if someone were to ask me about like that question about purpose, I think it would have more to do actually the with the real world relationships I have.
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely a collection that has relationships on its mind. And I'm wondering, I think I've probably complained about this on this show before multiple times, but I feel like most adult humans struggle with relationships.
Yeah.
Kids, it's easier. It's like, hey, you want to play? Let's go play. Like they have like an instant kind of camaraderie. Whereas I feel like the older you get, the harder it is to make a friend and keep a friend, or even to know what it means to be a friend. Like these are things that I think about because, there's casual friends, which is like most people, where you can hang out, have a good time, maybe even have like a meaningful conversation, but you better not ask too much of them. Otherwise they'll peace out. Like the measure of somebody who truly cares about you is somebody who's willing to like sacrifice time, energy, resources to help you if you're down or if you're going through something. You sort of find out about people when you go through something, or by seeing who are the people who kind of stick around. But I don't know. It feels like a lot of human relationship is pretty cheap. Does that?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to sound too negative because I think we only have so much energy to give to the world. Like you can't expect everybody to kind of be like super deep with everybody in their lives, but it just feels like people are so consumed with their own stuff that they don't have much energy to give to others. And that applies to me. I'm sure there are many times I swing and miss, in friendships that I have with people where I don't even see them. I have no idea that they even needed something. And there I was like self-consumed, but this is something you think about.
I agree. Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, yeah, I got an email from my friend and UK publisher Claire Drysdale this morning. We both have 8-year-olds, and they've hung out a total of 3 times, I think. And she just sent me this email about something else, and she said, "P.S. Theo just commented to me this morning, apropos of nothing, that that it's so interesting that he's only seen Covey, my son. He's only seen Covey 3 times in his life, and they're really good friends. And it was so, Covey would say the same thing about Claire's son Theo. And it's true that there's this I think it's like a lack of inhibitions, or a sort of lower level of inhibition when you're a kid than when you're an adult. That plays a role in that. It would be hard for me, I think, to meet someone 3 times and say to myself, "Oh, that's one of my really good friends." And then I think also, I think my novel deals with it more explicitly than my story collection, but I am concerned, I think maybe partly having a background as a business reporter, with the way that capitalism exerts itself on us. And I think also it's not, part of it is psychological, but I think part of it is that as adults, living in a capitalistic system and world and society, like, we face a lot of pressure that makes it difficult to show up in that way as an adult, as we did when we were younger. So I think that plays a role too.
So, in your novel that you're referring to is The Immortal King Rao.
That's right.
Nominated for the Pulitzer Prize, or a Pulitzer Prize finalist.
Yeah.
So as a human being in your day-to-day who is thinking a lot about relationships, and I'm imagining you want to be like good at being a human in relationship to other humans. Like, do you work really hard at it? Are you a person who has a ton of close friends? Do you like schedule time? And are you really good about being social?
I would not say that I am particularly good at any of that. No, I would not. Having said that it's important to me, I would not argue that I'm any better at it or worse than anyone else. That said, I learned some tricks. I started some things during the pandemic with friends that are useful. So with a couple of my closest friends, we have these weekly phone calls where we have a time on our calendars where we make sure we get on the phone and like go for a walk. I go over to my mom lives down the street from us now, and I go over to her house every morning for breakfast, which, has the benefit of like serving my selfish private needs in addition to being time to connect with my mom. So, I do those kinds of things. I have with a couple of my closest friends in town, like we have a weekly lunch hangout, but I wouldn't.
See, you do make time.
Yes. So the takeaway from this podcast should be that I'm an amazing friend.
But, I feel like some people are better at it than others, or more naturally inclined. You have people who just kind of like effortlessly social. I kind of marvel at those people. I think where I'm at is like, I feel like the older you get, it's good to just have like a few really close friends.
No, I would get behind that. I agree with you. My son says you should have a best friend in each city, but only one.
In every city?
Yeah, in every city. He's a very worldly child.
I mean,
kid
Theo
I mentioned, this kid Theo's his best friend in London.
Yeah, that's good. That does it is nice to have a friend in a city when you're visiting. Somebody to help you, maybe a place to crash.
Exactly.
That kind of stuff.
I think it's sound.
Yeah, it is sound advice. So you mentioned your novel, The Immortal King Rao, which was your debut, right?
That's right.
I mean, that's quite a debut.
Thank you.
I mean, right? Not very many debut novels become a Pulitzer Prize finalist, and and also a very well-reviewed book. That's a very strong debut. And I was reading about you as I was prepping, and I believe your father was instrumental in the genesis of that novel, right? At least partial. Like, that's right. Part of the core of that novel is due to a conversation you had with your dad.
That's right. Yeah, I was on a train in Peru with my dad. My dad's wife is Brazilian, and we went to Brazil, and then we traveled to Peru. And I remember on this train ride, my dad, I was in graduate school, and my dad was teasing me about writing short stories, actually, ironically, now that I have this collection coming out. He was like, nobody reads short stories. The novels are where it's at. Like, you need to write a novel. And then I, teasing him back, was like, all right, Dad, give me an idea for a novel then, if it's so easy. And he gave me a couple of really bad ideas, one of which was like Romeo and Juliet, but set in in Israel and Palestine. And I will say no more about that horrible idea. Horrible for me. Good idea for somebody else, I'm sure. Horrible for me. And then he said, well, why don't you write about our family coconut grove? Like, that's a good story. And in fact, our family coconut grove in India, where my dad grew up and where we still have family, like, is a fascinating place. And my family story on my dad's side is a fascinating story. And so when he said that, I was like, oh, yeah, maybe I should write that. And I started working on this novel that was about this child growing up on a coconut grove in the 1950s in India. And what happened was I had just recently been working as a tech reporter at the Wall Street Journal, writing especially about Oracle, and therefore researching tech companies started in the US in the 1970s, including Oracle, but also Microsoft and Apple, and like reading oral histories of those times just so that I could do a good job on my beat, which was covering Oracle. And so that ended up sort of filtering into my mind as I was working on this novel too. And I ended up sending this kid who grows up on the coconut grove in India in the 1950s to the US in the 70s to start a tech company. And that's sort of like the premise from which the novel evolves.
Yeah, the reason I want to talk about this, I mean, A, it's interesting, but B, I feel like this is often the case with novels, is that it's rarely just one idea that leads to the birth of a good novel and to a workable novel for the author. It's usually a combination of disparate ideas. And it's like the magic is in the combination. You start with that family story, the kernel of this coconut grove in your family, and kind of that personal history reaching back through time. But it is not until you combine that with the work that you were doing as a tech reporter and with this interest that you have in Oracle and these, big tech companies that formed in the 1970s, that the novel really coalesced, right? And then we should say too that you also had to arrive at, forgive me if I screw this up, is it Athena?
Athena, yes.
Yeah, it was like the voice of the novel was sort of the final puzzle piece.
Yeah.
Where once you figured out her voice and her story, that then you really had something, right?
That's
it's like
right.
those are the three big things.
That's right. Yeah. Athena is the daughter of King Rao, who's narrating the story. And she was the last piece to evolve. What happened was I wanted to write about this family coconut grove and like Silicon Valley in the 1970s. And I didn't feel that I had the chops to write about those things, like in the first person, for example, or in a close third person perspective, like writing about King Rao as if you're right there alongside him, because I hadn't had those experiences that I was trying to write about, even though I could research them. And I was watching Battlestar Galactica at the time, like the Battlestar Galactica from the 2000s, where there's this technology that lets certain characters access the minds, the consciousnesses of these other characters. And I was like, oh, well, if I could have a technology like that in the book, that would solve my writing problem, like my authority problem, because I could have somebody else telling the story, but with all the information they would need about this character to tell that character's story. And so for a long time, it was like, I didn't know who that voice was. Like, I thought it might be like a weird, like, bleep bloop computer program telling the story. Like, it was disembodied voice for a long time. And then eventually I realized that it was King's daughter, Athena, who was using this technology to tell his story.
You say this on the day, and I was just looking online at this before we started our conversation, but I believe Elon Musk's Neuralink is now about to start human trials with its chip implants, brain implants, which seems very ominous. I don't know who these guinea pigs are, but my God, you could not pay me enough money to have one of those chips put in my head.
I know. And when I started writing the book, Neuralink didn't exist. And over the course, I spent a long time writing the book. So over the course of writing it, suddenly like Neuralink was there and Elon Musk, one of the richest men in the world, was behind it. And I was like, wait a minute, did you read an early draft of my novel or something?
Well, but I mean, I feel like this book, The Immortal King Rao, I feel like artists do their best work when they do the work that only they could do, right? I mean, it's like, it just makes a lot of sense with your family history and with this work that you're doing as a tech reporter in the Bay Area, like who else could write that novel but you, right? You know, I mean, maybe somebody could, but it just feels like
Yeah.
this combination of experiences that you put to good use. And it was a long haul. It took you 13 years to write that novel.
It did. Yeah.
I
Um,
love stories like that. It took me 10 years to write my book. And so
yeah, so
anybody who can beat me, I'm like, yes, thank you. It takes a long time to write a book, especially when you got other shit going on. Like,
it does. It does. You know, and it's really great. I love telling people that, especially students of mine, because I have students, writing students who will be like, I've been working on this project for 3 years. And I'll be like, I know somebody who's been working on a project for 10, who, was working on a project for 10 years, more than that. I still haven't met a student, at least, who's come anywhere near the 13 years it took me to write that novel. The story collection took about that long, too. Um, and I think it's partly because I really, truly do love the revision process. Like, I really like staying in a project. I don't know if this is true for you with that first book of yours, if it was partly that. And then, of course, it also is, nobody's paying you to write these books while you're writing them, and you've got to make a living, right? So there are all kinds of other things that you need to be doing with most of your hours to sustain yourself and your family
well,
while
and yeah, I was
writing.
going to say, and you're a mom, you've got a young child, like that stuff takes up time. But
Exactly.
I feel like, too, like it just as a temperamental thing, maybe it's such a long shot that you're going to make serious money with a book. And there's no need for another book. There are so many books. So if I'm going to make a book, it has got to be the very best I can possibly do.
Yes.
Otherwise, I'm not publishing it. And
Yeah.
unless and until I get to that point, it's going to sit on my hard drive. That's just the way I am. Maybe if I had maybe it's different for you now that you have like this Pulitzer nomination and there are people like ready and willing to publish you. I'm imagining, you have a little bit more latitude in that way. Maybe it's different and you feel a greater sense of urgency because there might actually be like a real incentive, like financial incentive to keep making books. But I think for most writers, what's the use in putting out something that's not your very best? Like, I don't see the point.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I'm curious, as somebody who also spent 10 plus years on a book, like, because for me, I still feel like I'm like, if I had just had like a decade more on that novel, it would have been better. Or with the stories too, like if someone had just given me like another 5 years, I would have nailed it. Did you like? I don't know. Do you think it's like, and you talk to a lot of other authors too. Do you feel like that's just the lot of being a writer? Like you never quite feel like you nailed it?
I think so, if you're being honest. But I also feel like, there is a point at which there are diminishing returns in the editorial process
Yeah.
where, if you're kind of just going over the same thing and you're just moving some words around, you can sort of sense that. I think maybe it's like as time goes by, you haven't looked at the book in a while. One day you sort of pick it up off the shelf and start flipping through. You go, ugh, all you can see are like the warts,
Oh my
and
God. Yeah.
I think that's natural. But at a certain point, you do have to let it go. I will say that with my most recent book anyway, I haven't had the kinds of lingering feelings of doubt or I wish I could go back and fix it that I had with my
Mm.
first novel. Um,
Yeah.
I
I
think
feel
the
that
sec,
way too with my second book.
yeah, maybe that's just part of like the process of maturation, or you just, I don't know, but that's just been the case. And I think if you take a decade on a book, you better be reasonably comfortable with it by the time it goes
Right.
out. But another key point to make, and I think one that listeners who are writers would benefit from hearing you talk about, has to do with the uncertainty of the process. I've had people on this show countless times talk about this and the necessity of having to learn to live with uncertainty, creative uncertainty. This is a novel that did very well. Got nominated. It was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Like dream scenario for anybody writing literary fiction. And yet there were many moments over the course of those 13 years when you had serious doubts about whether or not it was ever going to be completed, or if it was completed, if it would ever be published, or if it was workable, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I can remember one moment in particular that is like a very obvious one. When I was in graduate school, I got this literary agent interested in representing me, and I was like, sure, sounds great, an agent, perfect, sign me up.
So wait, and you were
And
at
she
you were at Iowa for
I was at the Iowa Writers Workshop, yeah,
okay,
for
right.
graduate school. I won't say this agent's name, but this agent became my agent in, I guess, 2009 or 2010. And in 2015, I gave her what I thought was like my almost done draft of my book for her to, give me edits on, and then we would send it to publishers. And she read it, and then we got on the phone, and she was like, "Yeah, so I don't see it. I don't know." And I was like, "All right, well, what are your notes? Like, just tell me what you think, and I'll fix everything." And she was like, "Yeah, I don't." Basically, she was like, "I think it's beyond fixing. I don't see anything here." And we hung up, and I was like, "So now what?" And then I called her again and was like, "So are you kind of saying maybe you should not be my agent?" And she was like, "Yeah, I think that would be best." And so I didn't have an agent anymore. And more emotionally relevant, like I had this person who I had sort of trusted to like be the representative of the book out in the real world, telling me like, you have nothing here, this is not viable. And it was a real setback for me, like psychologically, artistically. And what happened was I ended up, my husband, the writer Andrew Altschul, went to graduate school with an amazing writer named Brando Skyhorse,
Who recently guested on my show.
Oh, amazing! I haven't listened to that one yet. Yeah, so Brando was a grad school colleague of Andrew's and was represented by my dream agent Susan Gollum, and made an introduction to Susan. And Susan read the same manuscript that the previous agent hated, and interestingly didn't like. She wasn't like, "This is brilliant, the best book I've ever read," by any means. But she did see the promise in it, I think. Like, she saw all kinds of problems, just like the previous agent had, because there were all kinds of problems, but also saw like what was interesting in it, and like thought she could give me some useful notes, and thought that if I worked on it a bit longer, it would get good. And she made a bet on it and decided to represent me. And then, another 5 years later, she sold the book.
Okay. So here's a question. The version of the manuscript that you handed to Susan Gollum after this previous agent you'd had a falling out with, did it include the Athena voice? Like, how far evolved was the story and your understanding of it by the time you handed it to Susan that first time?
That's a great question. If it had Athena in it, Athena was in it, but she was barely in it. Like, it was unclear. She had no storyline. She was barely in it, and she was just sort of this narrative voice telling the story of King Rao, but it was nothing about her as a character was very developed at all.
Was the technology where she could access her father like through this kind of like Neuralink-like device, was that in there at that point?
That was in there, but I will tell you that I remember one of Susan's big notes to me, and a lot of people had this note, was like, "This makes no sense." Like, I don't know, maybe it's partly because like technologies like that weren't being talked about in the real world yet, so it seemed really inconceivable. But but I think also it was the writing. I think the writing wasn't there yet. A lot of people read earlier drafts and were like, "Wait, what are you saying that this character can do? Like, what exactly is she doing here? How can you like write about it? I mean, in a fictional way, but like in a plausible enough fictional way that like we believe that this actually is something that could happen." Yeah, it was a nightmare. It was so hard to develop that aspect of the book. It really is what came last. And it's interesting because a lot of the reviews I later read, or like in interviews I later did around the novel, the part that I think really feels like the most present, interesting part to a lot of people isn't the stuff on the Coconut Grove or the stuff in the 1970s, but is like the part that's set in the dystopian future from which Athena's narrating the book, which came in the last, I spent 13 years working on the book. And I think most of that material came in like the last 5 years.
But it's also, it makes sense, it makes emotional sense to me that, as a reader, you want to know what the consequences are of the life of Rao and the company that he built and the technology that it disseminated around the world. Do you know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense. Like psychologically, if I had a student who was working on this book with like material in the distant past and then the kind of distant past and then something happening sort of like in contemporary-ish times, I would tell that student people are going to be most interested in the contemporary story.
and the details of Athena's life,
Yes.
because
Yeah.
it's like the heart of the book.
That's
It,
right.
it humanizes it, and it gives it, like, I think like a heart dimension is like the way I think I would
Yeah.
characterize it. And it's just interesting how we come to these things over the course of a creative project, and they seem so obvious with the benefit of hindsight, and yet they weren't obvious at all as you were like working your way through that decade plus.
Right. And there's so many things that you tried doing over that decade plus that aren't in what people read now, that are like all the failed attempts, like all the things that you thought were the thing that needed to happen in the book.
And but you feel like the thing, if you had to point to one thing that really brought the novel into a workable form, was by telling Athena's story. Like, that was the piece that was missing. And that
Yes.
once you did that and you handed it back to Susan, it was like, okay, it's go time. Like, this works.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't describe it as like, it was like a long,
By the way, I made this sound like Top Gun or something. Like the two of you, like,
let's go.
yeah.
Let's do this thing. Um, no, I mean, what the reason I'm laughing is because, that was Susan read several drafts. My husband, Andrew, also a writer, as I said, read, a good half dozen drafts of the book. Friends read. I really relied on other people. Speaking of the porousness between the self and other, I, as a writer too, like, really, really rely on the feedback of others in shaping anything I write. And certainly with this book, like, there were so many points over those 13 years where I was at a loss and then somebody else told me what to do, and Susan was that person many times.
I'm the easiest person to edit. Like, you tell me anything, I believe you. I'm like, yes.
Yeah, I'm the
I will
same
do
way.
that.
I'm like, all right, let's go. Let's do it. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll do it. I'll get rid of that character. I don't care.
Yeah.
If you don't like it, I don't like it, but
That's right.
I think as a process issue, I think I used to be more guarded. Maybe I had kind of like a foolish confidence. I was like, you know what, I'm going to know when this is ready, and then I'm going to hand it to my agent. I discarded that with my last book. I had many people read it before I handed it to her. And I just think, as like a quality control issue, to use like a tech industry term, I think it's actually really wise to have like writer friends, to hire a developmental editor if you can afford it, to kind of take the book through its paces in that way before you start submitting it to publishers or even handing it to your agent, can be a good thing.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I it's also like any book, any piece of writing is ultimately a piece of communication, right? Between like your consciousness and some reader's consciousness. And you don't, because we're all not totally knowable to one another. It's like you have no idea whether what you intend to convey is actually showing up on the page in a way that like other people are going to be able to interpret, the way you had in mind, or like in a way that's equally satisfying. And the only way you can know what that's going to look like is by trying, like experimenting and having a bunch of different people, ideally trusted people whose opinions you believe in, read the book.
So you publish that book, you take it out on submission. I imagine Susan sells it quickly, or did it take a while?
It took a minute. It wasn't, you hear all those stories of like a book selling over a weekend or whatever, and this certainly wasn't that. It was a couple of weeks, or more, maybe more than a month. It wasn't some kind of like immediate, everybody wants to publish this book kind of situation.
Okay. So, which I think is the norm, rather, that's the rule
Yeah.
rather than the exception. And at what point, once the book goes out, do you feel like maybe this thing has a chance? Or did you have that moment where like the reviews started to come in, or you started to hear from readers, And then like as in tandem with that question would be like the becoming a Pulitzer finalist. I have to imagine that sort of like helped. Like that had to kind of, what's the word? Like give it some juice. Like suddenly there's a lot of interview requests and probably more readers are coming your way, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think like the one exciting moment early on was, I think it was maybe the weekend before the book published, or maybe the same day or something, the New York Times published their review by this critic, Justin Taylor, who I really admire. Um,
Especially after he reviewed your book so well.
yeah, yeah. Now I really admire him. Before May 2022, couldn't care less about the guy. No, but he wrote this glowing review, and not only was it glowing, but I felt like he sort of talked about some of the things in the book that mattered to me. Like I said, you never know and can't really control how other people are going to read the book, but he read it in like sort of like close to the way that I was hoping people would read it. And I think that was a significant moment for me. And then with the Pulitzer thing, yeah, that was like a total shock. It's not one of those, I don't know, maybe if you win, they tell you. I don't know. Do you know? I was just scrolling through Twitter and saw it.
Okay. I actually did like what I called like a Pulitzer special where I talked to, like I had these people on the show and then I talked to them after the Pulitzer experience. I had Ernan Diaz, who won for his novel Trust.
Yeah.
And then Ingrid Rojas Contreras, who her memoir was a finalist.
Yeah.
And I was talking to them about this very thing, where it's like you're just kind of going through your daily life, and then suddenly your phone starts blowing up. They just drop the news.
What did Ernan? He's a friend, so is Ingrid. But what did he say? Did they tell him before, or he just the announcement?
He was on book tour, I think, for the paperback. I could be botching this, but he was in, I want to say, South Carolina. He was at like a Greasy Spoon. I think he had to catch a flight later that day to like go back home. But he's like, I'm going to get like biscuits and gravy and have a beer. You know what I'm saying? It was like noon.
Yeah.
And that, like, suddenly his phone rings and it's like his agent or something calling to tell him. And he goes outside and is like weeping. And then there are these like three like little old ladies from South Carolina who are like, "Are you okay, sir?" Oh. And then like he tells them, he's like, "I just won the Pulitzer Prize," and then they're all like group hugging.
I love that.
Yeah. So I mean, there's all different ways, but I feel like with the Pulitzer in particular, they just sort of drop the news online.
Yeah, I wondered about that. Yeah, I mean, for me, we were living in Madrid for a year, which was amazing. But we were living in Madrid, and my husband was out of town. He was on some kind of, where was he? Anyway, he was traveling. And I was solo parenting, and I had all these like back-to-back phone calls I had to do at night with people in the US. So I like had just put my kid to bed, and I was on one phone call, and then I had 2 minutes in between, and I was scrolling through Twitter, and then suddenly saw this news that I was a finalist for my novel, and then I had to get on my next call I'm teaching this year at Colorado State. I'm teaching in the creative nonfiction program. And so my call was with the writer Harrison Candelaria Fletcher, who's the sort of full-time nonfiction faculty member here, and a friend. And so I get on the phone with him and I'm like, "Harrison, my book was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize." It was like the first thing I said and all I could talk about for the first 5 minutes of the call. And then, we ended up having, it was a meeting. It was a call to plan for the year ahead. So, but I had to get that out first.
How do you deal with like normal Zoom calls after that? Yeah. You sort of need a minute.
Yeah.
To like process it. But I'm curious, what were you doing in Madrid for a year?
So my husband teaches creative writing at Colorado State, and had a sabbatical, and I can work from anywhere with all the various things that I do to make a living. And so we took off and decided to go to Spain. Andrew had spent a bunch of time in Peru, and his novel, The Gringa, is set in Peru, and he's a very conversational Spanish speaker. But I grew up in Canada and learned French growing up, and Covey didn't have Spanish, and so we both wanted to learn. And so we went and spent the year there, and I took immersive Spanish. I was taking like 2 or 3 hours of Spanish every weekday for a year. And Covey was in bilingual school, and we just spent the year in Madrid and had a really nice time.
Oh, that sounds great. That
Yeah.
sounds great. So before we go anywhere else, I do want to talk to you about the work that you do as a journalist, which informed, as we've been discussing, the Immortal King Rao, and might inform some of the stories in some ways. But in particular, the timing of your journalism career. Like, you come out of Stanford undergrad, you are hired by the Wall Street Journal as a tech reporter in the Bay Area covering Oracle, correct?
That's right. Yeah.
This is like 2005, 2006.
That's right. Yeah.
Larry Ellison is presiding over his kingdom. A young Mark Zuckerberg is building his. You had interactions with Zuckerberg as a young reporter in the Bay Area covering the tech beat?
I did. Yeah. So what happened was I had gone to Stanford. I graduated in 2004, which was the year that Facebook started. And they started at Harvard, but one of the next university campuses, they started on university campuses. So one of the next campuses they opened on was Stanford. And I was working like at the school paper, the Stanford Daily, as an editor when they did that. And so I was covering this like phenomenon on campus, or rather editing the journalists who were covering this new phenomenon on campus, and was like very aware of this. And then when I graduated that year, some of the kids I graduated for went to like work at Facebook and ended up being, among the first 50 or 100 or whatever employees at Facebook. So it was very much in the zeitgeist, sort of socially. And then I graduated in 2004, and I actually went to New York for a year or so to work for the Wall Street Journal in New York. But then I came back and got this job in the San Francisco bureau. And what was happening was that nobody was really covering Facebook at some of the major publications, because it wasn't the way business journalism, business reporting at that time was conceived, was that you would cover publicly traded companies. Like, startups were new enough that you didn't really cover them closely unless they were big public companies. And so there was no Facebook beat at the Wall Street Journal at that time. It was still a pretty small company. But I think other young reporters in general across the field felt like there was a story here. And so I started writing here and there about Facebook, and nobody else was really interested. It wasn't like a hot beat that people were coveting or clamoring to be assigned to. And so I ended up being the first Facebook reporter. I was the Oracle reporter, but they added Facebook to my beat because I just was the only one who was interested in writing about this company. Like, at that time, young people were on Facebook, but older people weren't really, which I know is a reversal from how it is now.
I was going to say.
And so through that, I wrote the journal's first big stories on Facebook. I interviewed Mark Zuckerberg.
What were your impressions at that moment?
I have to say, he came across to me. This is going to be a funny adjective, I think, to hear in today's context, but he came across to me as somewhat humble, as having a humble approach to the job, feeling like he bit off a lot, not necessarily more than he could chew, but he bit off a lot with this project. He started this company he was trying to start, and he wanted to do a good job. And he was getting advice from a lot of people about how to do a good job. But because it's Silicon Valley, like, the most influential people he was getting advice from were like people, prominent investors and business people in Silicon Valley who were giving him advice about like how to, I'm not saying that like it's their fault and not his that, Facebook grew into what it grew into, but I think like what I'm saying is that the building of Facebook ended up sort of it came out of this particular Silicon Valley culture that had certain business-oriented capitalistic ideals. And I think Mark Zuckerberg in his early 20s, like, probably could have gone in any number of directions. Like, maybe he could have made this a kind of like, made Facebook some kind of anarchist collective or a nonprofit or, a startup that never went public, or there are all kinds of routes. But he was building Facebook in the context of like the Silicon Valley that exists in the real world, not some speculative, hypothetical Silicon Valley. And so I see him like looking at that company now and looking at Mark Zuckerberg now, it feels less, I see him less as like this sort of I see him as sort of a product of the kind of collective in which that company was built. And so it gets, in some ways, gets back to what we were discussing earlier about like looking at people as not only as sort of self-contained individuals, but as sort of coming from collective traditions, belonging to collective communities, having collective identity. And I think Mark Zuckerberg very much was shaped by Silicon Valley in the early 2000s when he arrived, and like what the people around him there were doing and considering success.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I think it's easy for people to kind of want to take like a Marvel Comics like lens and apply it to these CEO guys and these like tech founder bros. They're almost all bros, right?
Yeah.
And to just kind of attribute to them this sort of like evil mastermind kind of thing. But the truth is that he's like a 23, 24-year-old kid, basically,
Yeah.
who is surrounded by all these money men who have, let's be honest, a vested interest in seeing their money grow. And so they're advising him and pushing him to do things that will maximize their profit.
Exactly.
That's it. And so that system, which is all about making stupid amounts of money, is what he found himself within. And to resist it, I guess he could have, but he didn't, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So when it comes to having spent time, did you spend time around Larry Ellison too? Have you been able to interview him?
I did. Yeah. I spent a little bit. I mean, I don't want to overstate the amount of time I spent with either of them. I probably spent somewhat more time with Mark Zuckerberg than with Larry Ellison, just because it was a smaller company and access was easier then to somebody like Mark Zuckerberg than someone like Larry Ellison, which probably, would not be true today. I didn't spend that much time with either of them, but I did interview them both.
Okay. But I mean, just to be in a room with somebody like that can be interesting and informative. I'm sure it informed the way that you drew King Rao on the page, right? I'm just wondering, like, what's your takeaway? Like, what are your feelings after covering that beat for a number of years about like Silicon Valley and like tech culture and tech bro culture? And then also, like, did you take away any insights into what it is to be like a founder, especially at that level? Who are these guys? Who are these people who do this stuff? Like, are there distinguishing characteristics?
Yeah, I think one thing that I can say is present in the novel and present in my sort of current worldview that probably is very much informed by that time I spent, especially in the kind of early to mid 2000s writing about tech, is a sense that, again, I guess this is related to what I was saying earlier, but a sense that like none of these individual CEOs exist in a vacuum. And in fact, like just, actually practically speaking, Facebook isn't Mark Zuckerberg. What Facebook is a bunch of investors, like people like me, people like you, many of whom probably don't even know they invest in Facebook. Like all of these people own some bit of Facebook and therefore represent, to the extent that like we think of Facebook as like this giant corporation that exploits people, like any one of those individual tiny investors, including, some teacher in California who's investing through her retirement account, right? Like any one of us like is a part owner of this company and therefore partly responsible for the actions of this company. And we collectively, all of these investors collectively have decided that this guy, Mark Zuckerberg, is going to represent us. And that's really like, in terms of the formal structure of these companies, that's actually how it operates. And so if you're Mark Zuckerberg, like, sure, you have a ton of power. I don't want to understate the power that somebody like Mark Zuckerberg has, but also you're beholden to the requirements of like this sort of anonymous mass of, of individuals and institutions who are the actual owners of this company. And so what I think I'm interested in more than the power of individuals sort of individual CEOs, somebody like Mark Zuckerberg or somebody like Larry Ellison, and is the way in which we're all sort of complicit, we're all sort of culpable, equally culpable. Okay, not equally culpable. Well, we're all somewhat, to some extent, complicit in these structures that we belong to, which is, I think, like a more complicated stance, like a more complicated way of looking at it, a more difficult way of looking at it than to say, like, Amazon's evil, Jeff Bezos is evil, but I do have that Prime account, but I have nothing to do with Amazon's evilness.
Yeah.
I think maybe my retirement account technically invests in there's some kind of mutual fund that's got Amazon in it. But anyway, that has nothing to do with me. It's Jeff Bezos, you know. So yeah, that's a long-winded answer to your question, but that's sort of how I think about it these days.
Well, it's a nuanced and I think closer to the truth viewpoint. I think these kind of like more facile, like easy, like kind of Marvel Comics assessments of it, you know, I get it. It can be convenient. It's also convenient that it totally removes you from having any sense of responsibility or culpability, but it's not that simple. And I think as a writer who's been working on this beat as a journalist, you obviously have an interest in this stuff to some extent and maybe a comfort level with it that most writers of fiction don't have. I don't want to leave this conversation without talking about the essay that you wrote about your sister using AI I think was published in The Believer.
That's right.
Yeah, that was really fascinating. Like that was like a truly formally inventive and interesting and touching piece of writing that integrated very explicitly technology for people who have not had a chance to read it. I believe the piece was called Ghosts. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Can you just kind of give an overview of what you did?
Yes. So the way this connects with my journalism is that in 2017 or so, I wrote a profile of Sam Altman, who is one of the co-founders of OpenAI, which is the company, the organization, entity behind ChatGPT, as we know it now. And through that reporting, through that profile, I learned more about OpenAI, and in particular, this technology that he was starting, that OpenAI was starting to develop, called at the time GPT-2, which was this technology, a predecessor to ChatGPT, where you could go into this interface and type some words and hit a button, and the algorithm would complete your text for you. So you might start like, I don't know, call me Ishmael, and hit enter, and you would get the rest of some text about some character named Ishmael. By the time I became really interested in this technology, it was called GPT-3. It was sort of the next version. And I wrote, in part through those connections that I'd made from profiling Sam Altman, I wrote to him, I wrote to OpenAI, and I said, hey, can I try to use this? I'm interested in my sort of with my creative writer hat on rather than with my journalist hat on. Like as somebody who writes creatively, I'm curious about what this technology can do. Nobody was talking about it too much at the time. And they said yes. And I started playing around, and the first couple of things that I did were more along the lines of fiction. Like I sort of like co-wrote this fiction story that I thought turned out really well, actually, with GPT-3. And then it occurred to me at some point as I was playing around, like this question of what I started thinking about this question of like what, when a technology like this becomes something that is marketed to outside, you know, in the real world. Like I started thinking about how these companies behind these kinds of technologies would try to appeal to people. And it occurred to me that like the appeal of a technology that could write for you, like the deepest appeal of that was to sort of like, might be to help people or purport to help people express something that is otherwise difficult or really impossible for them to express. And for me, that thing was the death of my sister and my grief over it. Like it's something that I still verbally and writing have a hard time expressing, talking about, writing about. And so less because I wanted to write an essay about this and more just because I wanted to see how the technology would function if I tried to use it for that purpose. I typed in this sentence about my sister's diagnosis with cancer when we were in high school. And I gave it this one sentence and asked it to complete it. And it completed it in this ridiculous way that had nothing to do with my real sister or with me. And I thought, well, maybe if I write, maybe I didn't give it enough. Maybe if I write a little more, it'll get closer. And so I tried adding more to that initial sentence I wrote. And it did get a little bit closer. And I thought, well, if that worked, maybe if I write even more, it'll get even closer. And so I just kept trying and trying. And what ended up happening was I ended up kind of compiling 9 of those attempts, the 9th of which includes a ton of writing from me and just a little bit from GPT-3, in this essay that is about my grief over my sister's death, but is also in a kind of meta way about AI, about this question of like what big tech will appeal to when they start selling us these technologies, what sort of emotional need they'll be appealing to. So yeah, it's kind of a complicated, it's sort of a complicated essay that's about, you can read it on lots of different levels. Like you can read it just as an essay about my grief over my sister's death. But there are other ways in which it can be read as well.
Well, I think the part of it that's so interesting and moving to me is that you have this technology, which is, a lot of us view it as dystopian, like soulless, like super mechanical and kind of creepy, like this sort of like robot intelligence, all that kind of stuff. And yet you're collaborating with it on something that is like so close to your heart. Like the most sensitive, emotional territory, like in your being, and you are using robot intelligence to kind of suss it out. That is like a really interesting juxtaposition.
Absolutely. And, I actually, I have an essay partly about the process of writing that essay in the issue of Wired that's out now. It's not out when we're talking now, but it comes out tomorrow. So by the time people listen to this episode, it'll be out. So I wrote this essay where like the animating question for the essay was, how is it the case that for me, like honestly, for me as a reader of that essay, the best lines of the essay were not written by me. They were written by the AI algorithm, GPT-3. And I was trying to square that fact, the fact that writing the essay and reading the essay was this moving, meaningful experience for me, with the fact that in general, I don't, I discourage my students from using AI as a writing tool. I generally don't use AI to help me write. I am worried about how these technologies are infiltrating our society on many different dimensions. My worry exists on many different dimensions. And I was trying to, I was like, how can both of those things be true? Like, it seems like a contradiction, or it seems at the very least like it's hypocritical of me to have written this essay, profited from the existence of this essay, and yet be telling other people that I don't think anybody should write using AI. And so I have this essay that's like an exploration of that. And I think I kind of come out the other side of that confusion in the essay. But like one thing that was interesting to me when I wrote Ghosts, when I was writing this Wired essay, and continues to be interesting to me and like hard to wrap one's mind around, is the fact that like as a reader of that essay, I think that some of the best lines were written by the AI. It's like, what do you do with that as a writer?
Well, I can relate to it. I think that when you're dealing with something that's very emotionally painful and and like psychologically and philosophically challenging, that's what, like my last book was all about that. Part of the reason it took so long is that it was about loss and like struggling with like my son's disabilities and all this stuff. And it's just these certain things happen to you in life. And it's like, you just take a big punch, right? And you're just kind of like blank. Like, what do I say about this? Like, how do I possibly, where do I start? You know what I'm saying? And like, I found myself kind of frozen with it. And so I relate to this idea, or this notion that you had where like, okay, let me see what the AI can do. I never did that. I'm sort of jealous in a way. I'm like, that's brilliant. But I mean, that it makes sense to me that for certain things that are really, really challenging to language, that you might use AI to kind of midwife it, to kind of help you, like just get some words out, and then you can maybe mess around with it and make it your own or whatever. But it's just a really interesting use of the technology and a really inventive essay. I think it's brilliant. People should read it. Before I let you go, I kind of want to bring this full circle to the new collection and to this issue of grief, which kind of pervades the collection. And there's a line that I believe one of the critics who reviewed it wrote. I always write these things down and I don't attribute them, so forgive me whoever wrote this. I liked it and I'm going to read it aloud now. But the line reads, "Facing the unthinkable helps these characters loosen themselves from expectations about how their feelings should manifest and why." And I felt like that was a really illuminating insight into the collection and into a lot of the characters in the collection who are reeling from something or dealing with some sort of relational and emotional difficulty. And in particular with the issue of grief, I want to ask you about this, because this has kind of been my experience, is that in a weird way, when the quote unquote worst happens, it can be freeing. And it's not something that often gets articulated, but I think it's a very common human experience. There is that element to it. In a strange way, it's like this liberation almost. I guess you don't have to be afraid of it anymore. It's like happened. And then also, I think like a lot of the conventions of culture and society just seem like, it's like, whatever. You're just, they fall away. The bullshit just sort of falls away, at least for a time. I think the veil slowly rises again. I don't know how permanent it is, these insights that we have, but I do relate to that, and I think it's like this like half joke that I will tell about like some of the best moments in my life have happened at funerals. And it's for that reason where I just feel like human beings are most human then. And I feel like a lot of the static and fog is just like gone in those moments. And it's it actually feels quite nice.
Like the sense of artifice maybe drops away.
That's right.
Yeah.
And
well, you stated it beautifully. I don't know what more I can say about that.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I guess like just, was it explicit in the creation of these stories to kind of look at characters who might be in that space where they are kind of knocked sideways, but also because of being like destabilized in that way, they might be in a moment or in a time in their lives where they are at liberty to a degree that they normally are not. That's an interesting place to find a person in. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like I hadn't thought about it that way, but I think that's an apt description of it. I mean, I think the very like creative writing workshopy voice in me would say something like there's most, to the extent that any piece of literature, whether it's, a short story or a novel or an essay or whatever, like is interested in showing change, right? Like showing something that happens to someone and how that changes them. Like, I think those are moments in which change is sort of inevitable, because it's like, you have to go somewhere from here, where are you going to go? Which I think is maybe just a different articulation of what you're saying, right? Like freedom, that using that language, that term freedom to describe that space is, I think what part of what you're referring to is like the freedom to change, right? Like the opportunity to go somewhere else from here.
Yeah. Well said. I have really enjoyed meeting you.
Me too. What a good conversation. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, congratulations on the new collection. I always ask people before I let them go if they've got anything else going. It's fine if you do not, but are you working on a follow-up novel to The Immortal King Rao? Do you have another story collection going?
I'm actually working on, since we talked about it, I'm working on a collection of essays that includes ghosts and also includes this Wired piece that I told you about. And Pantheon is publishing it in 2025.
Oh, look, that's a very complete answer. There's a lot of certainty.
Yes.
Usually people are like, well, I'm sort of in the middle of the first draft, but this feels like it's happening. And
I have a real book with a real deadline. I mean, not that the books with uncertainty aren't real books either, but.
All right. Well, we will look forward to it. Vauhini, thank you so much for taking the time to talk.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.